one of the things that came up after the first tech talk that we had back in February was when we looked at sort of what could newsrooms be doing with all this sort of social platform flux, as we called it, the polite way to sort of say it. But what was really happening was like we heard from a lot of folks that they really wanted to look at newsletters more as a platform that they could have more control over. And there's a lot of wisdom to that. And I think, as you're probably seeing in your own news organizations, that's probably true. So one of the things I've always asked is like, why newsletters? And I'm going to put up some things here that I've found have been helpful over the time I've been working in newsletters. You know, and it's changed over time, and I think each newsletter serves sort of a different purpose, and we'll get into that in a second. But to me, I feel like at the core, newsletters can really sort of help you build a connection with your readers that otherwise gets lost on social platforms because they're being bombarded with other things happening all the time and scrolling, where it's a little more static. You can have a little bit more of a conversational tone. You can sort of set the agenda, as it were. But I'd be curious to sort of see in the chat, like I'd be curious, like why have you created certain newsletters? And what purpose do they serve? Because I feel like that's something that we often don't think about too much, but really keeping the audience in mind and what sort of service you might be providing for your community as a result of your newsletter will help you in the long run. And the other thing I think newsletters can do too, I should go back real quick, is that they can create a two-way conversation. And, you know, I've seen this happening in, I know we did a project with the Arizona Daily Star when they were helping to sort of attract some audience. They want to reach some different audiences. And one of the things they did is they did a lot of audience research. They did some Facebook ads, they did surveys, and they ended up coming up with a Spanish language newsletter that would target just a sort of part of their community that they felt was underserved or that they knew was underserved. And so one of the things that I feel like you can be doing is helping to kind of figure out how to really get, and I see someone here in the chat said to have your readers' email addresses, and we're going to get to that because yes, data, that kind of data collection is great. And so, but you can build community and sort of and hold events around with your community as well. And this is something that when I was at the Compass experiment, one of the things we did fairly early on in Youngstown at Mahoning Matters was to start using the newsletters as a way to get people coming back to and having conversation with the newsroom, almost having like newsroom office hours, and using a newsletter to kind of attract that. And then from there, generating ideas and reporting back out to people that we got this idea from this forum, and then continuing to hold more. And we were doing a lot of that sort of, and obviously as a startup, we had to kind of build that kind of community as much as possible. So we're always looking for ways to do that, whether it was focus groups, but the newsletters were really how we're getting hold of a lot of people. Otherwise, people would have to just find us, you know, on the web, which they did, but we had to reach other people to do that. So one of the things that I found has been helpful, and we actually talked a little bit about this actually at our staff retreat last week with some facilitators folks who came in to kind of help us think about facilitation. But I used to do this, did this a lot with nonprofits, which is sort of this reverse mapping or backwards planning, where you sort of you put your end goal out far out in the future, and you can do this on a whiteboard, piece of scrap paper, you know, whatever works for you. And then you sort of map the steps backwards to where you are now. And if you think about what you want the end goal of this newsletter to be, whether it's driving subscriptions, whether it's a purchase of some kind, or it's an event you're trying to focus on, depending on what the style of newsletter is. But if you sort of think back, like what is your audience and your reader journey going to look like, and what steps do you want to have them take, and what kind of support will they need to get there? I think it's good to kind of map that out, and alongside that, map out what do you need to be doing as a newsroom, as a newsletter team, as an audience team, so you can sort of understand a little bit about what you need to do and how your workflow is going to kind of align with that. Because we often sort of think about the product, but we sometimes forget about the people who we're trying to reach, and also the people who are creating it. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about as well, because we all know in journalism right now, we've got way too many things to do all the time. And adding one more thing on our plate is never, never seems like a good option, right? So what can we be doing to kind of look at that as we do it? And if you map these things out, it can kind of help you figure out where are the pressure points. We did this a lot at the Compass experiment, because one of the things we did is we had a very popular morning newsletter written by the editor, and it was very much his personality and his tone that really set the success of that newsletter. But it was a lot of work. It was like writing a daily column. And so one of the things that we did was we tried to make sure that other people on the team were providing parts of content for that newsletter, so he didn't have to do it all, and that we could sort of support him along the way. And so he wasn't writing until 11 o'clock at night, even though sometimes he just did anyway, because he was just a glutton for punishment and an old school editor, and sometimes deadlines passed and he missed them and whatever. But what we tried to do as a team was to kind of support him along the way to make it as easy as possible. And eventually what happened is we started training other members of the newsroom to write one of those columns every day, or like one day a week. So he didn't have to do all 5 days. He ended up doing 3, and then 2 other days were somebody else taking it on. And it was a different tone and a different approach. The same basic content parts were there, so readers weren't shocked by it. It wasn't like a totally new newsletter. But what it did is allowed somebody else to kind of come in and also gain experience on newsletter writing, which is its own craft. It's a little bit different than news reporting. It's a little more like column writing, and it was really helpful to kind of see that, and it helped spread the load around the team. And then they all understood. So then if someone was on vacation, we didn't have to say like this newsletter is going on vacation because so and so is going on vacation. There was ways for us to kind of keep it consistent for the readers beyond that. So anyway, those are sort of things to think about. Another thing I learned over the years is that, and I especially learned this in doing e-commerce and at the book publishing company, where we did a lot of marketing newsletters, was we tested everything. Time of day, subject lines, what day of the week, how we personalize things. And then later in like at Compass and other places, having our newsletter connected to our analytics allowed me to pull at least into Data Studio, long live Data Studio, which is no longer Data Studio, but actually having some time to sort of look at what was performing well and what was not performing well. And also just trying different approaches. At the Compass experiment, we tried, we had a straight RSS daily headline feed. We had this curated sort of hybrid version. And then we had one that was just curated. That was like the daily newsletter. That was the non-headline. It was like the morning matters is what we called it. And then we also tested some short run topical newsletters, especially around elections in 2020, because it was one of the things we found, especially in Ohio, is that the election laws were so different because of COVID, is that people were confused. And when we did a survey with readers about what was the most helpful for them, it wasn't just run of the mill, like a voter guide. They really needed more than just a voter guide. They needed a how to vote guide. And then one thing we also did too, and to the point where we probably almost got just shy of being annoying with the readers, is asking for feedback and asking surveys, collecting information, especially as when we were sort of new-ish, like the first 6 months to a year, we were asking people on a regular basis, every few months, like, how are we doing? Like, what would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? Would you be interested in, as COVID restrictions release, would you be willing to come to an event? Or would you want to just do virtual? And we would ask these questions because they were important ones for us to understand. And the newsletters, since we're going to thousands of inboxes, it gave us an easy way to kind of do some quick survey turnaround and report it back to people too. And I feel like that's something that that folks, we often forget. Don't just take the information in, but actually really sort of go back and report it back to them. So you close the feedback loop and you keep that conversation going. Because a lot of times people will sort of, I don't know if you're like me, but like you take a survey and you don't hear anything. And it's good to kind of hear back from that. If you've been asked your opinion, you've given it, it's a good way to kind of collect that information. So I see some folks here asking like what people use surveys. I think whatever you have access to, I mean, Google Forms can be pretty simple and easy. In fact, we did that a lot at the Compass experiment. And it was partly because we also partnered with Google News Initiative. So we felt sort of obligated to use Google, but we also had SurveyMonkey, which I think is really good. We at API now, we're using HubSpot surveys because we're doing a lot of our work out of HubSpot now. So I feel like those are good. There's also sometimes different CRMs that you can find. Like I know in the organizing world, there's like Action Network and some other that actually have survey functions. But Google's pretty simple and pretty easy. Yeah. So if there's anything else out there about every action, that's another one that we one of my last sort of community nonprofits I worked at, they used every action. It was very and Nation Builder. They were both really good. They were kind of like all purpose. So these are great. Yeah, so collecting data, like this is something I think someone mentioned too. And I think this is one of the reasons why newsletters offer a very, to me at least, sort of a superior alternative to sort of just going all in on social media. Because you can collect information from people. And if you use surveys, you can actually ask people to give you more information. So you can collect more data about who it is you're reaching and ask them to give you, especially if you want to target more over time around neighborhoods or zip codes or towns, depending on how broad the geography of your newsroom is and what specific needs you might see. Those are things you can figure out by collecting more data, because the platforms don't really share that data with us, and for a lot of reasons we don't also. A lot of the information isn't being tracked anymore too, because a lot of people are opting out of being tracked. And I think, and the more as we get into the cookieless world, we're going to need to be thinking about data collection and first party data specifically in order to kind of really, and it's not, and I think, a lot of people get squeamish around this, but I think part of it is not just because we're trying to use this for nefarious purposes. We're actually we want to make reader experiences better. And I think that's the part that I think we kind of forget. We get caught up on the idea that like data is going to be used for evil purposes, which, hopefully we're not doing that. And as long as you're protecting the data, you're not selling or sharing it to people who could do harm with it. People will trust you with it if it's helping them improve their experience with you, and how you can sort of do that. So I'd be curious to know how people are collecting and what they're doing with it. So. One thing that I've learned a lot over time is we want our communities to trust us, but we don't necessarily trust them with some of the information. And I think we have to sort of, someone's got to take the first step, and I think we can do that. And that's why I'm a big fan of including sentiment surveys, which are just like, happy, medium, frown. I mean, like it can be that simple, like just like how you feeling, that kind of thing. And how is this newsletter working for you? Like really simple. It doesn't have to be like a long, in-depth personality survey. It's just a real quick check-in. And the other thing is too, is like we found at the Compass experiment that people were willing to tell us what they wanted, because believe it or not, the folks who subscribe to your newsletters probably subscribe to other things. They probably look at many websites over the course of a day or spending time on social media. They have a user experience that can be helpful to you to improve your products, and having an open conversation with them about it really will be good for you to improve what you're doing and to kind of keep building that trust and understanding of what they want and what they can and what you can turn back and say to expect from you to them, if that makes sense. And asking them to weigh in on changes you might be thinking about is really, and this is a good question that Luann just put in here too. I would say trying to collect data, and you can do this in bits and pieces. And that's one thing. Sometimes people get overwhelmed if you ask them for all the information at once. So one of the things we did at the Compass experiment is actually we would do it in phases. And we even tested this as part of a welcome series. to say, could you, hey, now that you're subscribed and you've been getting these emails for, say, I can't remember if we had like 3 or 4 weeks out. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do, or could you register to be a user on our site? And so we would actually then collect more information there. And then maybe later on in different surveys, we would sort of target those folks and then ask them for maybe more information about like what town they were in, maybe ask them a little bit more about their occupation or their income. And I think that was sort of just, do that over time was what we found to be better. Because I know if you're like me, sometimes if I get hit with a big survey all at once and it's asking me like 20 questions about everything about my life, sometimes you just get distracted and you just stop, or it just takes too much time. So we try to do it in piecemeal instead, in phases. And that seemed to work. I think we got more robust information longer term. Yeah, but it's good. This is good. Good feedback in the chat too about like what other people are doing, because I feel like that's and keeping this feedback and reporting it back out there, it just shows you're not out there to please everybody, but you can at least listen, right? And you can at least give them a forum to have some feedback. And I feel like that's that can be helpful, because if they're signed up for these newsletters, they're vested in what's there, and so they're going to let you know what they like and what they don't like. And in many cases, it might spur some good ideas. But how do you sort of get people to give you these ideas? So one of the things that we shared, and we're going to share this engagement journal out again in the resources that we share with everyone later on after the call when we share out the recording, is that we presented this engagement zine, which you can download and print, believe it or not. It's not just digital, but with a whole bunch of activities in there on ways in which you can engage your audiences in real time. So, and this is one thing I think newsletters are really good at, is getting people to go do something or come together around an idea or a topic. And I'd be interested to see if people are using that, using their newsletters to do that, whether it's just to have a forum or discussion, or whether it's around a fun activity, or it's like meet us up at the county fair or community hall, etc. But here, these activities are there where you can actually help work through like some ideas and to help collect some more information and stories from your readers. And I think that's something that you can do, newsletters can do on their own, but I think if you can do that in real time, it will also help.